Hello everybody, Chad Crowell here, and in this video we'll be going through the second tweet of the Learn Kubernetes in 10 tweets. And if you see from the diagram here, in this one we're talking about the common interface or the API of Kubernetes. And because we have a single API for the Kubernetes cluster, we don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure, being it EMC or AWS or VMware or Dell or what have you. We can access that API just the same, and we can create Kubernetes resources, and we don't have to worry about, talking the language that those underlying resources, whatever vendor they're from, speaks. We just speak Kubernetes, so to speak, pun intended, and then it creates our resources from that infrastructure. We can use kubectl to access that API, authenticate, and then perform commands to create resources. Like, for example, kubectl create deploy, which stands for deployment. We can name our deployment Nginx and use the image Nginx. And by default, the image that it will use will be the image that's located in Docker Hub. And you can specify any container registry if you'd like. It doesn't have to be Docker Hub, but that's just the default. So if we do kubectl get deploy, we'll see that we have an Nginx deployment now, and we can do a kubectl edit deploy Nginx and see that the image is located within the pod YAML, which we'll get to in a later video. And these images are really convenient to use within Kubernetes because you can have your registry be located wherever. So it's a way to access your repository from wherever you are in the world. And also, it makes it so every image runs the same. So just like one of the main benefits of containers is that it runs the same on every machine, being that it's a packaged artifact of the application. It's going to run similarly in Kubernetes as well. And especially because containers are ephemeral, meaning they live and die pretty rapidly, this can transfer to another node and you can run that just the same. And so we can continue here to perform commands using our kubectl tool, like kubectl create cluster role binding, for example. And we can give that cluster role binding a name of root cluster admin binding. And we can attach it to the cluster role cluster admin. And we can associate that with the user. Let's just say the user Sandy. So now we've created a cluster role binding, accessing that same API interface in order to do so. So now let's clear the screen and run a command that will show us a little bit more about this API. So we'll do kubectl cluster info, and it'll tell us that the Kubernetes control plane is running at this address, and this is your API endpoint. And we'll also see that core DNS is running at that same address, but it also has a API path. So the path is API v1 namespaces kubesystem services kubedns. And this is also another way of accessing resources, passing through authentication, of course, but accessing resources directly from the API as opposed to using some other type of authentication mechanism. The authentication mechanism that we're using right now is called our kubeconfig, which is usually located in the .kube directory. So if we list the contents of the .kube directory here, we'll see we have a config, and we can view the contents of that by just typing in kubectl config view. And this is our client certificate that we use to authenticate against the Kubernetes API, being that in this case, the API server is its own certificate authority. So we're authenticating against that. So let's clear the screen and do a cluster info again. And we see the core DNS path there, but let's say we wanted to access the pods within our cluster using the raw API path. And so we could do kubectl get raw and then specify a path here. So app v1 pods, for example. And there's our output of accessing the pods using the raw API path. And if we wanted to make that a little bit prettier, we could pipe that to JQ, and there's a little bit of a prettier interface. But still, because we're accessing the raw API path, we don't get as nice of an output as we would normally if we did the kubectl get pods, or PO for short.